When I reported in with the first day of work there in Louisville, I found that the office buildings were complete and had been completed for a while, but the factory was nothing but a sea of mud with upright steel beams sticking out of that morass, and it was hard to believe that a factory could be formed from the apparent disaster that could be seen from the office door. I didn't have anything to do, so I took an interest in the work that was being done for the layout of the factory. There was a room assigned for that called the layout room, and it had a band saw and a table saw and some other power tools in there, which were always of interest to me. But the factory was being laid out in a quarter-inch, three-dimensional scale, and all the machines and the conveyors, overhead conveyors that wound through the tops of the roof trusses and up on the roof through the paint ovens and so forth, were all laid out in scale. And as I began to take an interest and study what was going on, my knowledge of the processes in Erie were of a great value to me in understanding what was needed to efficiently do the assembly and parts delivery to the assembly lines. And for some reason these fellows didn't have an appreciation for that, and they'd ordered machines with fixed rates of speed, which certainly would have caused great problems in trying to make more production or less. I began to see more and more of this type of thing that was going to come around and cost us a lot of money and serious delays. So I was undecided on what to do. I didn't want to cause a lot of animosity, and because I knew these guys that were working on it, and I knew they didn't have much of a background in what they were doing, but certainly they'd been around longer than I had. But I decided that I'd better talk to my boss about it, and so I went in one day and I told him that I wasn't trying to squeal or cause troubles or do anything of that nature, but I told him a few of the problems that I could see, and I was concerned about it. And so he took an interest, and we went into the layout room together by ourselves, and I pointed out the areas that would cause serious bottlenecks if we needed more production, and the fact that the machines that they had ordered were fixed rate, and several other serious considerations. And he looked at it for a few minutes and he says, he said, "You're right." He said, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do." He said, "From now on you're in charge of this thing, and you pick somebody that you think you can use and it'll be of help here, and let's get this thing done right." I couldn't believe it, a real dummy. But anyway, he took the other guys off, and I picked a guy that I knew that I liked and was pretty smart. We tore it all apart and started over and canceled. They'd ordered some machinery and some equipment, and we just canceled that too. And now that my boss had stuck me with this project, I had to figure out how to do it. And of course, one of the things that complicated the whole thing was the fact that we were going to start production on a brand new design, and so everything that was familiar with in Erie's setup had to be evaluated and changed in order to suit the new radical design. So the first thing I had to do was get a schedule and find out what the operator cycle would be based on the prescribed schedule that had been published, and then of course consider higher production requirements in the overall conception of what had to be installed. The air conditioner was based on three fundamental sub-assemblies. One was a refrigeration section, which had to be assembled and tested independently of anything else. Then the second phase of the assembly meant installing wiring and controls, and those had to be evaluated and checked before the third stage, which included appearance parts and shipping. I had to estimate the time to put the thing together, which side of the line was most convenient to do the operations. And of course, with the actual assembly line, which is a belt conveyor about 30 inches from the floor, the parts that were needed were either delivered by fork truck or from overhead chain conveyors. Fixturing and proper tooling to do each operation had to be considered.
My 2.5 years in Erie on that work factor job really gave me the information that was valuable beyond calculation on the establishment of the assembly procedure and the workstations that would be required based on the schedule. And the trick was then to gather enough work elements to fill each workstation's allowed and allocated time. In other words, if we had a 20-second workstation cycle, I had to know what could be done within that 20 seconds and without having a lot of leftover time or without assigning too much. So detailed knowledge of how long it took to do certain elements, such a simple thing such as driving a screw, had to be taken into account. And with my pretty extensive knowledge of those elements, I was able to calculate how many people were required to do total assembly. And of course, then HR could hire the people that we needed as we needed them. And of course, every time the speed of the assembly line had to be changed because of a schedule increase or decrease, each one of those workstations had to be recalculated and appropriate work defined for them. It was really interesting, and it was like putting a giant jigsaw puzzle together. Every time the schedule changed, all those workstations had to be recalculated, and of course it was a pretty simple task for me since I had such intimate knowledge of what was going on and what was needed and specified. It was like putting a giant jigsaw puzzle together, and it was important that I come up with the right number of people needed to put all of these components together and do the necessary testing and so forth, because they had to be hired and trained at a certain rate. We just couldn't bring about 300 people in one day and expect them to start producing. So key people had to be trained, and there had to be some pre-production made so that any bugs could be spotted before all the assembly crew was on site and standing around waiting for something to be fixed. It was embarrassing and not approved by the boss. So once we established a number of workstations and a close approximation of the number of assemblers needed, we could proceed with the layout, again allowing for future increases in production. In every decision we made, we had to consider what would happen if the demand went double, for example, or some such number. And so we had to be careful not to create impossible bottlenecks to future production requirements. But after all that was established and we had a good idea of how many people and workstations were involved, we could proceed with specifying the right types of equipment and all the other 1,000 things that had to be taken into account. We did that, and we started production reasonably well. We had some minor glitches, but nothing that held up the steady daily improvements in output. And it wasn't long before the whole assembly cadre had been employed and were on their workstations, and things were rolling along very well. I think my partner and I did a pretty good job with that whole thing, and we didn't get any compliments from our boss, but 40 years later, I had lunch with my old boss and a number of other guys from the office at that time, and my old boss said to me, he said, "Don, you did one hell of a job on that thing." And
it would have been nice to hear that 40 years ago when it mattered, but it didn't matter then, it didn't matter now either. But it was good to hear, anyway. When production had started and was flowing well and my help wasn't needed, I again was out of a job. And I went into my boss one day and I told him that, I needed some direction and what did he want me to do? I needed something to keep me busy and earn my pay. So he said, well, what do you want to do? So I said, well, I could work on cost reductions. And he said, oh, that's a good idea. Go ahead and do that. He was just trying to get rid of me. He didn't want to be bothered, actually. But in any case, there was a fellow upstairs in the design engineering group that was in a lull of workload too. And he was really interested when I approached him about this idea. So we pondered around a while about with it, and we decided that the best thing to do to make it original and productive would be to change the concept of cost reductions. The current system was that everybody was given a little book with a carbon paper in it, and you wrote out your suggestions and you gave it to somebody who apparently trashed them because it was totally ineffective. So we decided that it would be best to have a representative from each of the disciplines on a team of maybe 10 guys or 12, whatever it was. And that way then any politics or resistance to change could be overcome by a member of the discipline that was dragging his feet. So that's what we did. We took I think there were about 150 salary people in the office there, and we broke them down into groups. Every team had a marketing guy and a sales guy and an engineering design guy and a quality control guy, manufacturing and the cost accounting and so forth, so that there was no one discipline could control it, and we could get cooperation out of the various groups that we needed to get it from. So we launched that off, and we set up prizes at the end of the year. We had no idea where to go with budget, so we just picked a number, and the teams were required to have a meeting every week for an hour or so. And part of the format of the meetings was to do what we call blue sky thinking. In other words, we encouraged the members just to say whatever thoughts they had in their mind about a certain project or something, even though it didn't sound like it made any sense. The other team members should be listening for some gem or some spark of an idea that nobody else had thought of, and then try to develop that into a project. And so that no one was criticized for what they said, even though it may have sounded stupid or whatever. No idea was considered worthless. And it took a while to get that concept in, because a lot of the guys didn't want to say something that they had thought of but sounded so stupid to themselves that they were embarrassed to say it. But that gradually caught on, and it yielded, well, I don't know how much results, but it was a spark plug for getting new ideas and unusual ideas or different approaches to a problem without criticism and sarcasm or whatever. To look at their situation, and each team was given a budget to meet. And the best team, of course, would get a super prize of some sort. We hadn't decided that yet, but as it turned out, our idea of combining the disciplines really was the key to the whole thing. This is an example of what we did. We took each component and made a layout showing the cost for each of the various segments in that component. And this is the compressor display, and it shows the costs associated with manufacturing that part. This shows a meeting of of a team. I think it's a marketing team, and they're looking at displays of air conditioners and talking about what they can do to improve the costs from their aspect of it. This is me when I had the paint and plastics department. I was the captain. Each team had a captain, and we had a bogey. This is a 1963 one, and we were assigned $100,000 annual savings. That savings had to incur during the fiscal year. It couldn't be over a number of years. This is another view. This is a display we had. We had a big outing at French Lake. The team position was shown on this graph. This is me and a buyer and an engineer from one of the other sections, and we're looking at a plastic grill. These guys were on the same team.
The first year we saved $1 million, and I have a picture of the mud that we had given to everyone in celebration of that achievement. Of course, at the end of the year we had a big blowout somewhere. I still have mine after 1960, 40, 60 years. 60 years ago. Unbelievable.
It was incredible. And so the enthusiasm for the program became infectious. It was actually fun. And the competition between the teams was interesting to see. The program, I think, still continues, and it's spread across the Appliance Park. It was so successful, and my friend and I each received a managerial award of $300 cash as a recognition of our contribution. The amount wasn't as important. It was important to me, the dollar amount, but in effect the recognition and the management awards were sparsely handed out. So it was a nice gesture on the general manager's part. And he once said that the profits of the room air conditioning department were essentially that of the VIP program savings. So it was an important factor in the profitability of that division. Within 3 or 4 years, I had been given the opportunity to go to Crotonville twice for management training on the company's management training program. Being given the opportunity to go to this school was not a common occurrence, and I felt honored to be able to do that. The school at Crotonville was originally an estate of some very well-to-do person who had donated it for this purpose. And they had a staff there and very nice facilities. Pretty intense week each time I was there. This is a picture of one of the groups that I was with on one of the times I was there. These men were from all over the country and different parts of the world each time. This was the typical size of the class, which repeated constantly, and they had some other classes of several months duration for the general manager level. I wasn't quite at that point yet. On the return leg of my visit there, I took the ferry from Crotonville, which is above New York City, down the East River, and it just happened that that was the night of the enormous blackout on the northeast corner of the United States, and the whole city was absolutely black as we came down the river. And it's not a sight that's likely to be repeated and hadn't been done before, so I was privy to a unique, once-in-a-lifetime view of New York City. I just got the news today, October 19th, 2022, that Crotonville and its 62-acre plot of ground is now for sale. GE is closing it down because the company's in a terrible situation, being split into 3 parts, and so obviously they can't afford to maintain the concern and instruction of their managers as in the past when they were well managed and prosperous. It's kind of sad to see a company that was number 2 in the world when I worked there dropping now, not even listed on the New York Stock Exchange. You know, I've been thinking about this Crotonville school that I went to and its ultimate sale recently, and I can't help thinking that why in the hell didn't they follow their own teachings there at the school? Otherwise, I think that the company would still be surviving. And one of the things that I recall about it was that you need to stick to what you know in your business and not diversify. And one of the issues that sank GE was the purchase of NBC and real estate development and things that had no connection to the manufacturing aspects of the business. Insurance, you know, they made money at it, but it was a distraction and a chink in the focus on being the best manufacturer in the world, which GE was at the time that I worked there. I think this is some MBA satanic vapors that entered into the thinking of the leadership of the company. I guess I shouldn't have left. That's now that I think about it. They just couldn't do without me.
During this time, I made a few trips to several places, and I stayed in a motel that had GE air conditioners installed in the windows, and they'd been there for 2 or 3 years, I presumed. But I was really alarmed at the amount of rust that I was seeing along the back edges of the cabinets and interior parts. And it really was a shock to me that our paint and the protection we were giving the base metal, which was just cold rolled steel, wasn't more effective than it appeared to be. And this wasn't along the coast either. It wasn't subject to salt spray. So when I came back to the plant, I thought about it, and I had heard that galvanized steel coating on cold rolled steel was really an excellent protector. So I had the buyer buy me some pieces of galvanized steel in the gauges that we were using, and I had punch press section shear me a bunch of samples. There's a specified corrosion resistant instruction. It's universally accepted for analysis of paint and other coatings. And so I had the samples sheared into the size. They were about 10 inches by 4 or something like that, with a hole in the top so they could be hung in a salt spray bath. I had, as I said, maybe 50 or 100 of these pieces chopped up. And I went next door to Building 5 Refrigeration Laboratory. They had a very extensive lab there for evaluating corrosion, and they had the specified system there to produce universally accepted results. And they were very picky about how they set up the salt spray tests. But anyway, there was an X scribed on the front and back of each of the panels to the coating that was being evaluated. And the scribe was specified as to sharpness and pressure and so forth. They had a little machine to do that so that the scribes were equally imprinted on the test panels. But anyway, I had samples made of galvanized and painted and bare steel painted as a comparison. And after 30 days, the test results were absolutely astonishing. The ungalvanized painted panels were a shambles. Even the steel, some of on the edge had been corroded away. Whereas the galvanized panels, the scratches and edges were almost unmarked by the salt spray resistance. by the resistance of the salt spray tests. So I took those panels to the engineering manager, and I showed it to him, and was promoting the fact that we should be buying galvanized steel for our products. And he wasn't impressed at all. He gave me the brush off. So I went to my boss, and he didn't get too excited either. But I kept running these tests. I ran several hundred of them to make certain that I wasn't getting an anomaly there and was leading somebody down a primrose path. But the tests were easily reproduced and the same results each time. So I kept, over a period of maybe a year, I kept bringing it up, and of course the manufacturing engineering guys in the fabrication section didn't want it either. They were afraid that they'd have problems drawing the steel and forming the shapes, and of course spot welding those parts together was an issue. Techniques had to be developed to spot weld to the softer and lower temperature melting point of the galvanized, and they were dug in. They didn't want any part of it. And eventually, perhaps a year, I made sure that marketing guys knew about it too. So there was a lot of pressure on engineering to change the specifications for the base metals. And of course, so eventually the big cheeses there decided that that was the proper thing to do. And of course, it wasn't a cost reduction to do that in the shop. Galvanized steel was substantially more per pound than the bare steel, but the field results were so impressive and overwhelming that there was no way that they could, in good conscience, not convert. As I mentioned earlier, I had installed through the windows and through walls quite a few air conditioners, and the mounting kit for those air conditioners was expensive and hugely over-engineered. They had sliding steel bars and a whole raft of parts. The cost of the mounting kit was around $5 a unit, and I don't remember how many parts and screws and brackets and so forth there were, but boy, it sure was a pain to install them. But they were afraid that they would fall out of the window, so they were super careful. But I did some clandestine testing myself when I was installing them, and installed them using only a few of the parts, and I felt that they were perfectly safe that way, and I made up a kit, a sample kit, and I showed my boss, and he was really impressed with it. And I managed to get it presented to design engineering, because I knew that the design engineers would be embarrassed and reluctant to make any changes to their design. And so they rejected it outright. I mean, there wasn't any question about it. Of course, marketing guys liked it because it made the selling job easier and eliminated a source of complaining about the complications of it. And it was complicated. It took a big sheet of paper with detailed instructions on how to assemble each of the kit parts before you install the air conditioner. But in any case, the next year they came out with a modified one. They eliminated several of the heavy pieces, but they still didn't go the whole way. And it took several years before they finally came around to the very simplified thing that presented. I worked on a number of projects in attempts to reduce costs and so forth during the interim period before the next phase of my attention. I won't talk about those because they weren't too successful. Only talk about the ones that paid off. One of the things that I did do was look at the cost of plastic parts that we were buying. We used quite a bit of plastic on the front and some interior stuff, and it seemed as though the prices we were paying were pretty high.
it looked like the contributed value we could do if we made it ourselves would really generate a lot of savings. So anyway, it resulted in the purchase of a large injection molding machine. That's my boss and me, of course, and Earl Kirk, the press operator. And he's showing off one of the grills that we were making then on that first attempt at molding plastics parts. As you can see, this machine is about 40 feet long. We ended up with 20 of these, and eventually we got into the molding of Lexan outer cases, and that required a couple of much larger ones than these even. The savings on this first machine were so outstanding that it started an avalanche of buying new machines and putting up an extra building on the side of the main building to contain them. So it was really a swiftly growing and rapidly developing process that wasn't done there at Appliance Park before that. So I had the unique position of learning the machine and learning the process and how to do it. And it was a really fun time for me. I was the expert. I was the manager of the paint and plastics departments for 5 years or so. During this time we built another house with 5 bedrooms and much more space, and of course on a sewer system. Final number 8 boy. So things were going along very well. There was a good era in our lives. Shirley felt well, and the job was going, really got boring when it was going so well. In the fall of 1970, the company announced a new plant opening in Frankfort, Kentucky. The company had built a new plant in Frankfort a few years earlier to make pressure gauges, and had gone bankrupt. And so this essentially new facility was available, and the company decided to purchase it and make the plastic components for Appliance Park at this new location, or at least a good portion of them, because the rise in the use of plastics was almost exponential across the park. Appliance Park was a large facility. It had 1,000 acres and 6 large manufacturing buildings and a warehouse under 18 acres of roof for all the products that were produced there. And those included washer and dryer and dishwasher and disposal, and of course refrigerator was the big one. They had 2 of the buildings, one for compressor and one for assembly of the refrigerator, and then room air conditioner, which was building number 6 and the last one to be constructed, and a total of 25,000 people. So when this announcement was made, I was fortunate in having learned plastics from absolute zero knowledge to doing well with our facility. And as I said, we had built an additional building attached to our building, and we had 22 large injection molding machines whose average cost was well over $100,000 a piece, and whose ROI of right at 3 years was enough to make the lips of our grimace bean counter twitch into what I suppose was a big smile. We did all kinds of decorating and painting, and we had close control on our inventory, and our quality was always very, very acceptable, and our delivery of parts to the assembly lines couldn't be faulted because we never did shut them down because of part shortages in all the years that I was there. Of course, that was our number one priority, and the wrath of God fell upon those that shut the assembly lines down because of the part shortages. And I didn't intend to be one of those recipients. But I had a good crew, and they all did their job very well. And we kept a very clean house, and we did our own quality control. The quality control department in every part of the company had roving inspectors in the factory that performed random inspection tests on products, which was supposed to control the quality. And of course we were afflicted with those young people mostly that didn't know anything. And so I approached the quality control manager and I asked him for a 3 month hiatus. Let us prove that we could control our own quality better uh, than the roving inspectors, and that he could use those people elsewhere where he was having trouble. So he was very reluctant about that, but he granted me a 3 month leave, if you want to call it that. So I had already written quality plans for every job. So when I announced that the operators would be responsible for the quality, and that they had to know their quality plan before they started a job, I was amazed at how enthusiastic they were about that. It gave them some sense of responsibility and accountability, which amazingly it was really great to see, and it worked so well too. They were really eagle-eyed about the quality of the parts, and of course the 3 months passed without a hitch. And so we were the only department I feel confident in saying that in the entire General Electric company that ran without inspectors. I was manager of the paint department as well as the plastics department, and I want to relate a story about the foreman of the paint department. His name was Andy Lucas, and he was a friend, but he was a character. I first met him in Erie, and he was the foreman, or general foreman, of the paint department up there. And he had his own fiefdom up there that he ruled with an iron hand. And nobody told Andy Lucas how to run that paint department or how many men he needed or whatever it was. They told him what the schedule was, and boy, it was hands off from there. But that was not good for the company, and it gave Andy some ideas of power that he really legitimately didn't have. So they decided that they needed an engineer to cover that area. And they hired this young guy, and of course we met him there in the office. It was just a big open office, that desks side by side in those days. And he was a young guy and green, and so we tried to give him some tips, but the tips that were given to him were not for his benefit, but for our amusement. And one of the things we told him, and there were a dozen of us giving this kid advice on how to deal with Andy Lucas. And so it boils down to the fact that he had to take charge. He just couldn't let Andy continue being the sole arbitrator of that paint department. So we told him that the way to deal with Andy was to strike fear into him. And you did that not by being friendly and weak, but the first impression would really be the critical one. So we told him that he should go out to Andy's office and yank the door open, no matter what Andy was doing, and go in there and pound the desk with his fist and tell Andy he was the new planner, and by God, what he said went. So this kid actually believed that crap. So we we primed him up to go out there and lay the law down, and several of us watched from a safe distance. So he did. He yanked that door open and went in there, and he did the pounding on his desk. And well, Andy didn't say a word. He just got up and he walked around the end of his desk and grabbed that kid by the seat of his pants and his collar, and just physically threw him out of the office. Oh well, the kid didn't last long. He found a job more amenable to his bravery. But anyway, that was not untypical of Andy. And he was a big guy. He was not any weakling. A big 6'2", maybe 225 guy. He's an older guy, older than me, that's for sure. But he was in good shape, and he was a farmer too, so he got plenty of physical exercise away from the factory. But in any case, when it came time to move to Louisville, of course, Andy went down, sold his farm there in Erie, and bought a farm out past where I live, a few miles, and settled into a nice place out there. So when I became associated with the paint department, I knew better than to try some stupid tactics. So I just there were a lot of quality problems in the paint department, and Andy was not a lover of fooling around with quality. So I did quite a few things in terms of process improvements and implementing chemical tests in the various baths and so forth, so that the standards would be met anyway. Andy had an office there in the paint department that had been built when the factory was put up. It was a shop office, but it was enclosed and air conditioned. The original guys that came to Louisville in the management position were older guys, and they began to retire one at a time, and the guy that was leading the manufacturing left, and a new man was assigned to that job, and his name was Brault, and he was a little short guy, and certainly past middle age, and a tough little nut. I ran into him shortly after he came there when I was with my friend upstairs, and we were organizing the VIP program, and he had already laid out some of his ideas, which were contrary to what our thoughts were about it. So I went around his back, and I went to another section manager, his level, and I told him the problem, and I asked him to put a bug in Brault's ear about his idea that maybe we should wait for it or something. And this guy did. He was fully in cooperation with us, and so he mentioned to Brault about it. Well, of course, Brault then knew immediately where he'd gotten that information, and so he called me into his office. Here I am, a lowly, not even 30 years old dummy, going up 4 levels into an office that rarely saw the likes of my carcass. And he never said a word about the the actual reason for being called in there, but he stood at the window looking out, and he didn't really want to put the cruncher on me, but he wanted me to know that I had really screwed up politically. And he made it abundantly clear in a very clever way that that wasn't too bright for me to go to another manager and try to get my way around him. And he was right. I shouldn't have done it, but you live and learn. But he had ideas about the organization of the manufacturing group too, and he decided that the officers out in the factory were detrimental to the way that the foreman and general foreman could do their jobs. Kind of guy, when he said something, he meant it, and so he instructed the central maintenance people, which were in a different location in the park there, to come in one weekend and destroy and remove all those factory offices. There were 5 or 6 of them. So nobody told Andy that his office was going to disappear over the weekend. Well, when he came in Monday morning, there was this big blank spot, and his desk still sitting in the midst of a not very well cleaned up area, and of course the floor tile was still there around his desk, but the office and the air conditioning and everything was gone, and it broke his heart, really. The humiliation and the disregard, it was a really terrible way that he was treated. He wouldn't have been any happier had they told him ahead of time, but he certainly wouldn't have been embarrassed in front of his employees and made It was just stupid. I don't think Brault thought about notifying people ahead of time, or if he did, they were afraid to notify Andy. But in any case, it really was a downer for him, and I really felt sorry for him because that paint section was a hot place. We had ovens, huge ovens that baked the paint on, and they were on the roof, but the heat radiated down, and we had a big hot molten salt cleaning system to clean the paint off of the paint hangers on a periodic basis, and that was right near his office and radiated a lot of heat. And the factory itself was hot too. There wasn't any air conditioning at all. And then in the winter, the huge doors that were adjacent to his office, to the exterior, were open and closed constantly because we stored finished goods out there, outside, in many cases. And so the fork trucks had to pass through this huge van door that just left snow and cold wind blow into the area there and blow the papers and stuff off his desk where he was trying to do the paperwork he had to do. It was really an intolerable situation. And then when I was made manager of that department, Andy resented my presence, of course, but I knew I had to do something to make him more cooperative and friendly. So by this time we had another change in management. So I had a prefabricated office installed there for him, and I didn't tell Andy. I had it done over a weekend, so when Andy came in Monday morning, he would be pleasantly surprised, and that was really an icebreaker for our relationship. I can't tell you how much he appreciated that. But we still had a long way to go because he had far too many employees. He hired people and brought them in just on a whim, and it was notorious. The reputation for that paint department was notorious throughout the whole factory. Everybody knew that Andy had people laying around sleeping, and even the auditors had written a report in the past about the excess number of people. So I had to face that issue. So I decided that each of the foremen would have their own little business, and they would be held accountable for certain things which were under their direct control, such as spoilage and idle time, downtime, press downtime, or their expense supplies such as gloves and whatever. I made a budget for each of the foremen with about 6 items that they could control the costs for, and I made a nice little chart for each one with a frame around it. And each week I posted the results from the prior week's activities. And of course the budget line was in big black line across the chart, and the performance was either above or below that black line. And it was incredible the interest and the competition that these foremen took into that business. Of course, they knew I was going to recommend increases based on their performance, so they had an incentive, but it was far beyond money. I know that the third shift foreman in plastics would go around the plant at night and steal gloves from the other departments so he wouldn't be charged with any additional gloves, because each foreman had to go to the tool crib or assign somebody to go to the tool crib and get gloves for his operators, and his department was charged for them. So there was a record of everything. When I left GE, I thought that GE was sure needed a lot of improvement, but after I worked on my own and worked for different companies, I realized that GE was the god of cost control. There wasn't anything that was used in the factory that wasn't assigned a cost, and it was a great system. It wasn't complicated. It was just everything had a handle on it and could be measured. It's the only way to run a business. You can't. I worked for a number of businesses that made money and were profitable, but they didn't know where they were making it, and they didn't know where they were losing money either, which product lines should or needed attention or dropped or something. Incredible. Everything was dumped in a big bucket, and they didn't really know what they were doing. But that wasn't the case at GE, and so it made it very simple to measure each foreman accurately. So I didn't have any trouble with the plastics foreman because I personally hired each one of those and brought them up through the ranks. So they had a loyalty to me that Andy didn't have, that's for sure. So I had to tackle Andy in a different way. So I set up the same kind of budget system with a nice frame, and I walked in his office one day and I attached to the wall. And I had set his budget so sloppy, I knew he wouldn't have any trouble making all of them. And when he saw that, he says, "Get that GD thing out of my office." I'm not, typical old bull of the woods. So, in order to get Andy more enthused, or some enthusiasm aroused in him, I went to the other foremen and managers around the area there and in manufacturing, and I told them what I was doing, and I asked them to just mosey by Andy's office once in a while and just look at the charts and be astonished at how he was really whipping those numbers, and what a really great job. Give him some BS anyway. And they did. They were all having fun with him, but everybody knew Andy. And Andy really began to believe the stuff he was hearing, and he turned 180 degrees toward getting costs reduced. Actually, it got to the point where I had to make sure that he didn't go too far and get us into trouble with delivery of parts of the paint to the assembly lines, and what other things had to be done. There were certain expenses that couldn't be avoided, such as cleaning hangers and whatever. And so, but it was really fun to see that. And Andy's whole demeanor also changed 180. He became friendly, and he was enjoying his job finally after all those years, and he'd been with the company for over 30 years at that time. So I still feel good about that. I made Andy's last few years at work fun for him, and he had a heart attack, and he had to retire a little sooner than he had planned, but nevertheless, I still value that. Well, there are other changes I made in that department. I changed the design of the paint hangers so that they could be more efficiently, the parts could be more efficiently hung and unhung. And we painted thousands of parts a day. I think we painted around 65,000 parts every day, something of that nature, as I recall. And there were a lot of them anyway. And unhanging and hanging those parts, a lot of them were very small or odd shaped stuff, and it took a lot of labor to do it. So all in all, between Andy's head chopping and the improvements I made, we eliminated about 40 people over a period of 3 or 4 years, 5 years maybe. So it was a substantial reduction in painting costs, that's for sure. No doubt all this resuscitation sounds like really a hot air balloon, but since it's mine, I guess I can do what I want to. But I want to relate one more thing that I did basically for Andy. For years, the way he scheduled the paint department was take the production schedule for the week by model, and he did this at home at night on Thursdays. And he had a tray of 3x5 cards segregated into models, so that he had a series of cards for every model air conditioner we made. And we made over 100 variations of air conditioners, and they weren't all greatly different, some voltage differences and so forth, but they all had a different model number, and many of the metal parts also were different. So the right sequence of parts had to be painted because it took 8 hours to process through the paint department, and if it painted the wrong ones, it really created a large time gap that couldn't be made up, and potential for shutting the assembly lines down for a day was always hanging over us like the sword of Damocles. And of course, maintaining this file current with all the variations and changes that were being made on a pretty regular basis was a very difficult and actually impossible job. And of course, he made his own manual errors in transposing part numbers and so forth to this schedule that he wrote out by hand for the whole week. So it was a continuing problem of part shortages, or hung the wrong ones, or something or other. To an endless series of major and semi-major catastrophes. I tried to get the computer guys to include the paint department in the scheduling system, because every morning a van would deliver a pile of printouts 4 or 5 feet high to the front lobby, and it included all the other departments, but the paint department wasn't included. And these printouts showed the need for today and the next 3 days, and a hot sheet, and the current inventories and so forth. It contained valuable information that Andy needed to run his department efficiently. So I was not successful, though, in persuading the manager of that department to take some time to do that. And it just happened about that time that the company decided to teach Fortran and one other software system. I can't remember the name of it right now, but anyway, for the next 6 months, there would be night school classes on how to program these two pieces of software. So I decided to take that course, and I did. And I elected to use Fortran to implement the scheduling, and that blended in well with what they were using in the UNIVAC down in one of the other buildings, where they had the UNIVAC system established for the whole park. That was a huge installation. There was a room there probably 80 by 80 that was just filled with all kinds of whirling lights and spools and stuff. It was incredible. This was in the years when UNIVAC was just beginning in 1955 and 56. And this particular time I'm referring to is about 1961 or something. So in any case, I bit the bullet and learned how to do it, and I wrote the program for the paint department. And of course, once it was written, then the computer guys, all they had to do was enter it into the system. So every morning then Andy got a printed hot sheet and a schedule that was current and didn't have mistakes in it. It made his life vastly simpler, and it helped me too, because I didn't have to constantly be concerned about part shortages. That was a good stroke for old Andy and indirectly myself. I'm going to end this one here.